We are presuming that the listeners have become acquainted with what we call Circles of Humanness, and we're going to overlap it with a concept called levels of perception. We will presume that you have studied in the YouTube clip Michael Grinder House of Communication, and we're going to be looking at the third floor of the house where perception lives. We'll be referring to the north wall. When you are encountering a new person, what might you look for, and how would you know if your interpretation of that person's values, beliefs, and perceptual filters are accurate or not? We're going to suggest that in observing, we make the distinction between reality, which we're going to refer to as below the line, and our interpretation, which we'll refer to as above the line. We know from models like neurolinguistic programming that when someone does observe reality and they move into the world of interpretation, that we do distortions, deletions, and generalizations. How do we move from reality into the world of interpretations with more accuracy is the focus of this particular clip. We definitely want to make that transition from observing in reality to interpreting, because observation without interpretation is useless. And yet at the same time, interpretation without data supporting it is extremely dangerous. Knowing that there are 3 levels of interpretation increases the accuracy of what we have observed. Those 3 levels are called the micro, the macro, and the meta. Micro-perceptions are observing another human being's 4 categories of nonverbal communication. And those are visually, what are they doing with their face, especially their eye contact, their blinks, changes around the eye area, and facial expressiveness. The second category is auditory. Voice patterns of credibility, approachability. What is their volume, speed, tone, intonation, and pitch? The third category is the kinesthetics. We're looking at the person's gestures, the length of the gesture, the frequency of the gesture, the speed, the fluidity. Are the palms up? Are the palms down? What is their weight distribution like? And what is their proximity to another person or an object? The fourth category is breathing. Is the person breathing high or low? And are they emphasizing more their inhalation or exhalation? Examples of micro interpretation would be if we look at the person's face and their face is friendly, they're smiling a lot, and their eyes are softly focused. These would be the visual nonverbals, and we could say that the interpretation of what their face looks like is that the microinterpretation is that they are approachable. The danger in this is that you are taking one particular nonverbal, the face, and you're doing an interpretation on it. And then we have to remember Freud's famous saying, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So the danger of a microinterpretation is that it's faulty because it's too limited in what we're observing. However, if we are attuned to what the auditory nonverbals are, and we find that their voice pattern is very rhythmic, moves up and down, and their intonation tends to curl up more than down at the end of sentences and phrases, those auditory nonverbals add to the case that the person is approachable. And watching the person's kinesthetics, we notice that their palms are up, their head tends to bob as they talk, they tend to lean forward towards the other person. So the individual micro interpretations of the face, micro-interpretations of the voice, and micro-interpretations of the body tend to lead us towards the next level of interpretation, which is called the macro. The macro is when you have several individual micros that reinforce the interpretation, and in this case that the person is highly approachable. A macro interpretation is much more accurate than a micro interpretation. If you have a lot of macro interpretations, and especially if you're observing the person in a variety of contexts, and they all tend to point in the same direction, then you could say that the macro interpretations lead you towards a meta interpretation. Let's combine these levels of interpretation with what we call circles of humanness. Micro interpretations tend to be a reflection of the behaviors of the other person. Macro interpretations tend to be an interpretation of the person's styles, and a meta interpretation tends to be an interpretation of the person's sanctuary, where their values and core identity live.